Good evening. This is chapter 2, International Economic Institutions since World War II. My name is Christian Meda, and my group members are Jonathan Bow and Ersin Erdem. So what happened internationally into the economy after World War II? Well, one key thing that happened was that the United States and United Kingdom came together to form the World Bank. What is the World Bank, you may ask? The World Bank, recently known or first known as the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, was used in order to keep countries in check, set rules, and monitorize or supervise the trade and tariffs and income all over the world. And this happened because there was a lack of international cooperation that led to a complete collapse of economic relations. The International Trade Organization was proposed, but it never really was established until the year of 1995. And this organization was in charge of making rules between countries. And an example of these rules were world trade rules, business practices, international investments. And when this was set, the tariff and trade agreements were formed. The tariff and trade agreements were implemented in the year of 1948. And this also led us to trade rounds. Trade rounds were used in order to talk about a certain tariff in each round. So let's say, for example, the Kennedy round in the mid 1960s talked about one set of a tariff, which completely different between the Tokyo round in the 1970s. And what was discussed in these rounds, you may ask? It was the selling markets at an unfair price, non-tariff barriers to trade, and subsidies to trade. Also, after the World War II, institutions were formed. When people hear the word institution, they probably think about a formal organization, which is not it. An institution could be anything from negative to positive, and there is actually two. A formal institution is a written set of rules that explicitly state what is and is not allowed. And then the other set of institution is an informal institution, which is a custom or tradition that tells people how to act in different situations, but without legal enforcement. And these trade agreements, there was actually 5 agreements that were introduced, and between either two countries, which would be bilateral, or several countries would be plurilateral. The first agreement was the partial trade agreements, which led to free trade of output on one or a few industries. The second one would be free trade area, free trade on goods and services. The custom union, which would be free trade and common external tariff, and the common market, which would be free movement of goods and services plus custom union. The economic union would be common currency, the common market, and let me see, I can see the last one, which would be, one second, which would be the harmonization of economic policies. I'm sorry. And also, yeah,
So some notable RTAs mentioned in the chapter. In Africa, you have COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and ECOWAS, another common market, the Economic Community of Western African States. In Asia, you have AFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which is a free trade area, and APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, another free trade area. In Europe, you have a third free trade area, the European Free Trade Agreement, and the EU, the European Union, which is an economic union. In the Middle East, you have the Arab Common Market, or ACM, which is a customs union, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, which is a common market. And then finally, in the Western Hemisphere, we have Mercosur, or the Southern Cone Common Market, and then NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is a free trade area. Now, in this chapter, there are no formal models. So that's important to note. So economists are divided on whether regional trade agreements support long-run increases in world trade, or if they serve as obstacles to trade by polarization. So the arguments in favor of regional trade agreements are as follows. First, it is much easier for a limited number of countries to reach an agreement than it is for all countries worldwide to do so. Second, because RTAs limit the affected area, it prevents a surge of competition that may arise if the same reduction of trade barriers occurred worldwide. Third, because RTAs are more limited in scope, there's more freedom for experimentation. So you can consider RTAs in this case as a test run of potentially worldwide trade policies later on. And then finally, RTAs can be utilized as a political tool to encourage agreements in the WTO forum. So they have their diplomatic uses. However, opponents of RTAs argue that RTAs undermine progress towards worldwide agreements through polarization, because it separates countries into localities. Also, RTAs are often found to be discriminatory against poorer nations. So you usually have the larger nations taking advantage of those poorer nations through economic pressure. And then finally, they argue that RTAs are redundant for rich nations. Rich countries should have no need for trade barriers anyway, they state. And then here are some critical economic terms, which are incredibly useful for both this chapter and the future in this book. So first is public good. So a public good is any good that is both non-excludable and non-rival. Non-excludability means that the normal price mechanism doesn't provide a barrier to access. So an example here could be like an open park. And then non-rival means that one individual's use of a good or service does not limit the use by someone else. So you can consider a radio or TV broadcast where you're listening or watching that broadcast doesn't limit the service of someone else. It doesn't affect their signal. But public goods bring rise to the free rider problem. Free riding means that because there is no incentive to pay and there is no excludability, people will benefit who don't pay. And so as a result of the free rider problem, free markets are not going to produce optimal amounts of free goods. This is going to force governments to tax in order to fund these programs.
Okay, so the main three international organizations are the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. In this chapter, they mostly talked about the International Monetary Fund, which is considered the lender of last resort. This is sort of how like the Federal Reserve Bank always offers loans in case the company is in trouble, which is sort of a backstop so the economy doesn't completely crash. And in the 1900s, International Monetary Fund helped out with the Mexican peso crisis. And they usually step in when there's some sort of heavy currency devaluation or whenever a country is at risk of defaulting on its debt, which in, I think the early 2010 and 2012, there was the Greek debt crisis where the IMF and the EU came in with offering loans to the Greece. There's definitely some sort of prisoner dilemma dynamic at work in the IMF because since everyone pays into the fund, they all have to cooperate to work together to loan the money to these countries that are in trouble. And the problem with that is, say, the US controls a big portion of the IMF, they might not want to loan the money to a country that is not complying with the restrictions that they put on the country after, which is why it leads into the second point of sovereignty. And sovereignty means to be free of any foreign influence. Usually the loans that come with the IMF, there's always like strings attached. So say I take a loan from the IMF, I would have to correct things in my country that led me to the point where I would even have to ask for a loan. Like I would have to open my financial markets, become more transparent, root out all like corruption in government. All these things are like terms that come with loaning money from getting a loan from the IMF. It could be argued that IMF is influenced too much by the US government, because one thing that the IMF always asks for is it asks for these countries to open their financial markets, and the people that benefit from that the most is the banks and these companies that can come in and extract all these resources from these smaller countries. So there's always a question to whether the IMF has the best interests of the smaller countries that need the loans at heart. Trade agreements. Again, we go on this topic of, is it fair for developing countries? And it's hard to say, because these smaller countries like say Vietnam, they can't afford the best lawyers, and they don't have all the experience necessary to negotiate these complicated legal battles. And these smaller countries, the problem is that they're at risk of trade agreements that hurt them, because a lot of the nation's GDP is dependent on a small amount of sectors. Unlike the US, which has many industries, many sectors of the economy that they can diversify into. So if, say, like a smaller country has a trade agreement that works against them, their whole economy, I mean, a large portion of their economy is affected, which gives like a power dynamic skewed to the bigger players. And within these organizations, how it works is whoever pays into the organization the most, they receive more voting power. And obviously, the more developed country you are, the more disposable income you have that you could spend to gain power in these organizations. And it favors countries with more expendable income. Also, there's a question of, again, whether there's the best interest of these bigger players, whether they're just trying to take advantage of these smaller countries, or they actually want to help these countries. But I think the general consensus is that, or the general opinion is that there's a model that's been proven to work. And if anyone gets to the point where they need to take a loan from the IMF, then they should implement these strategic changes in their policy, so then the situation does not get to that level where they would have to ask for a loan again. Okay, so key takeaways. There's the organization of the World Bank, and which came after World War II, when all of these countries were divided, and the leaders of the new free world were pretty much asking themselves, how can we get to the point where we don't get into these disagreements anymore that start world wars? So that's why all of these world organizations were formed, so then we could cooperate together, because these countries are a lot less likely to go to war if we are in free trade with one another. Because since we are so dependent on each other, it's sort of like mutually assured destruction if we get into another war. Trading restrictions on rules and tariffs, that's just, taxes on goods that come in and out of the country, exports and imports. A public good is any good that is non-excludable and non-rival. Non-excludable just means that because I can access a good, it does not prevent you from accessing it. And a good example of that would be like a park. Non-rival means that me accessing the good does not take away from your experience. A public good suffers from the free rider problem, which means that because it's free, a lot of people will access it, which will degrade the quality of my experience accessing it also. Good example would be like a lake where you go fishing. If too many people go fishing at that lake, then when I come to the lake, there won't be any more fish. Okay, and there's a prisoner dilemma. Within the IMF, there's a prisoner dilemma within how to operate and whose interests to best represent. And it's been noted that less developed countries have less power and therefore their interests cannot be represented proportionally.